Okay, we're inside the Gimel Beis, 93b. And we are if you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines up from the middle-sized lines, like the narrow lines, go up 5 lines. The first word, Daniel. Mm-hmm. So we're on the list of 6 descendants of Rus, all of whom have 6 praises from the verse. And from there, the Gemara is going to go on a little bit of a detour, talking about various different details of the life of Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and Daniel. And then it's going to get into the context of Daniel and other prophets, Nehemiah and Ezra, Chagi, Zechariah, Malachi. So it's not going to be an overview of their history, but it's going to be not random, but various different details in their life that's going to pop out. And we're going to go through it literally, obviously, and the connection between all these details, I'm sure there's more and deeper, but the floor will kind of be open. At least as of yet, I haven't thought of anything that... I've seen some of the commentaries, but at any rate. So the last 4 of the 6 grandchildren, descendants of Rus, who have 6 praises. The first was David, Mashiach. We talked about both of them at length. And now we have Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, all together lumped as one, all 4 of them. One verse says all 4 of them. And similar to the praises of Mashiach, where there's more than just 6, but the Mishnah, the Gemara chooses 6 as the praises. The other one is introductory. The last one is like a follow-up or a continuation kind of thing. So similarly here, there might be a little bit more than 6 actual accolades, but there's only 6 that the Gemara lists as the official 6. And we're going to use Rashi's version for that. Where is that Rashi? After Koziva, there we are. Okay, so Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are 4 individuals, all of whom are descendants of Rus, at least according to this version. And they also have 6 praises in the verse. The Ksiv, as the verse reads, the Ksiv Buhu states of them. The verse itself is in the book of Daniel right at the beginning, introducing them kind of thing, and says, the verse opens up by saying, there were young men, or Yeladim, actually children, Asher ein bahem kol mum, who have no blemish, literally speaking, physically, no blemish on their body, perfect bodies. V'tuvei mara, good looking, that's 2. Maskilim b'chol chachma, they are, good morning. Maskilim b'chol chachma, they are, maskilim means like they are wise in all issues of wisdom. It's a capability for conceptualization. That's number 3. There's a tall. Where you have it? The Yodei Das, knowers of knowledge, Umevine Mada, and understandings of knowledge, Vasher Koyach Behem Lamed B'Heichel HaMelech, and who have the capacity to stand in the presence of the king, and that is our 6. No blemish, good looking, conceptualization, knowing knowledge, understanding knowledge, and strength to stand in front of the king. 6. Then the verse continues speaking, even though these are the end of the 6. For the Lamdam Sefer, they've invested the time to know books, the Lashon Kazdaim, in the language of the Kazdeites. That's how you say it. Kazdim. No, Hebrew. How do you say it in English?
Chaldeans.
There's the word.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Now the Gemara analyzes these 6 things. And again, the Gemara analyzes it seeming to be on a literal level, but of course I'm sure there's deeper things. You want to say something?
No.
I'm sure there are deeper meanings, but the Gemara seems to be analyzing, at least in the plain meaning, the Gemara is analyzing the very simple translation of no blemish, good looking, and all that.
But I think they were forced to study this. They were brought there to be part of that society.
Yeah.
So they had to study these books to become knowledgeable.
Yes, I guess that's why it's not part of the praise. but because they were smart and they were forced to learn it, they excelled at it. Maybe that way. So in other words, the learning and the knowledge that they acquired isn't part of the praise, it's only a consequence of the praise. Maybe? So you're right about that. Okay. So the Gemara analyzes these praises. Asher ein b'hem komum. They have no blemish in their bodies.
Yeah, actually to teach them, they're being taught the language of the Chaldean. Yeah.
Right.
From the kings.
That's correct. No, they weren't teaching. They were.
obliged to learn
Yeah, they're
all
forced,
the
yeah.
manners,
That's correct.
the laws, the books,
No, which-
everything.
So in that context, it would make sense why these are not part of the praises. In other words, the praises are to their character. What happened to them is something else. And they were successful at that learning because of those praises. Yeah, so it makes sense it's not part of the list. Okay. But the Gemara still quotes that part of the verse, even though it doesn't quote the first half of the verse, which is interesting. Okay. So the Gemara is analyzing what these things are. So first, Maya she'en b'hem mum. What does this mean? They have no blemish. Amar Rav Chaim bar Chanina. Rav Chaim bar Chanina said, "Afilu kirivda de kusilisa." I think that's how you pronounce that. Kusilta. Even they didn't even need to use an instrument of bloodletting. That's what it means. Bloodletting was a remedy back in the old day, which wasn't for someone who got sick. It was to prevent sickness. It was a way of I don't know what the science of it today, but back then the idea was they would literally make a cut in their arms and let their body drain of blood, and the idea was that the heart should produce new blood, healthier, fresh, new blood. That was the idea. And it was supposedly a way of staying healthy. The Gemara elsewhere, we talked about it in Brachos a little bit, in other places talked about at length about when you should do it and how you should do it and how good it is and how often you should do it. But these guys are so healthy they never needed to do it.
There's also alukot, like the animal that they
Leeches.
Leeches.
Yeah.
Also the same thing, same idea.
Well, actually, leeches, I think today they still use them also to take out unhealthy blood. They still use them today, I think, for like certain...
Suction cups in Eastern Europe.
Yeah. But I don't know if that's this. I don't remember leeches in the Gemara. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't remember such a thing. But bloodletting, certainly you've seen in many places. Okay, so they were so healthy they didn't even need to do this preventative measure of bloodletting. So even that lehavbu they never had. Okay, so that's what it means. They had no blemish, and then it says they're good looking. Okay, then it says they're smart. 3 different versions of smart, and the last thing is actually the 3 different versions of smart are chachma, bina, and das. Actually, the middle one das though, which is interesting. Chachma, das, then bina. At any rate, the last praise is they had the strength to stand in front of the king. What do you mean strength to stand in front of the king? I mean, if you have feet, you can stand in front of the king. What's the big praise? Omer Rabbi bar Chanina, Rabbi son of Chanina, explained, Malamed, it teaches you. They exercise self-control and do not engage in any frivolous chatter. Schreik literally means from laughter, like joking around.
Off-color jokes.
No jokes, period. It doesn't say off-color, no jokes. Menasicha, no frivolous talk, no wasted words, just random idle chatter. And they control themselves from sleeping. And they were able to control themselves even when they needed the bathroom. And all because of the fear of the king. So obviously, literally, the Gemara means literally in front of the king Nebuchadnezzar, that they were capable of full body self-control, both psychologically and physically. Control their minds, even though as much as they want to laugh at a joke that they heard, would not laugh, or as much as they wanted to get in on the Dvarim B'Telem, on the wasted words, they'd control themselves. And then, likewise, their physical bodies, they would control themselves from going to the bathroom in the presence of the king.
He wouldn't be the king of kings? They're talking about,
So literally, the Gemara is talking about Nebuchadnezzar. Obviously, one could look a little deeper and say we're talking about the king of kings. That's certainly a possibility. And if that were the case, which I would grant you that it probably is the case, that deeper that's what the Gemara means, then the challenge becomes to try to understand the previous 2 things. That they don't need bloodletting, and the wisdom, understanding, and knowledge is easy to connect to the King of Kings, but the bloodletting and the good looks, that's going to be your challenge to connect that to the King of Kings, which, granted, is probably there, and the floor is open to think about that. But I will say also one thing about talking about the King of Kings, and it kind of relates to Tanya. The way in which the Gemara describes that they had control is oinsinis ansman, which means they'd forced themselves. It's like the ultimate Beinani. Meaning, even though he may have the urge to do all these things, but he forced himself. Oinsin literally means to compel oneself. As opposed to, they no longer cared for laughter, they no longer cared for idle chatter. It doesn't say that. It says oinsinis ansman, which means they would literally, oinus is like someone who puts a gun to your head to do something. That's oinus. Control themselves. So it's like the ultimate Beinoni in that sense, that they may have wanted to engage in all this behavior, but forced themselves not to.
They overcame it. They overcame the urge.
Yeah. Oinsins, that's what, literally forced themselves not to do these things, even though they may have wanted to. So that's, if you're going to go down the route of, we're talking about the King of Kings and not literal Nebuchadnezzar, then I would suggest you bear that in mind.
But also said that you shouldn't lashot it in the kavim. Somebody needs to go to the bathroom.
They shouldn't hold themselves back. That's correct. It's another thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was
In
thinking.
Brachas, we had a lot, right? We learned in Brachas, one of the sages who was asked how he was so healthy that every single stop he went to the bathroom.
Yeah.
That's right, because he never, but here it's the reverse.
Yeah,
So.
but this is,
And yet,
context is different here.
and at the same time, they were able to never they were so healthy, they never needed bloodletting. So, you had to somehow put these things together. Control themselves, never going to the bathroom, and yet retain their health, even though the Gemara elsewhere says holding yourself and is not healthy. Yeah, these are all things that we have to think about. Now, if that's the case, actually, it would be easier to answer that Gemara by saying it's talking about a deeper level of connection to Hashem, and then you can more easily reconcile these things rather than the physical health. But you still have to reconcile the physical health business.
Here it is more of a self-control.
Yeah, but for sure, self-control. But the Gemara also said that they were super healthy, and yet this behavior of holding yourself in the Gemara says elsewhere is not healthy. Anyway, I don't know. At any rate,
Context.
yeah, these are all good points and all to be thought about. Okay, now the Gemara continues while having raised the issue of analyzing different verses with relation to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The Gemara now does the same for some other verses. And this is what I mentioned earlier, that the Gemara is now going to take snippets of their life and tell us a little bit about it. Okay. So the verse reads, the beginning of Daniel, it's 2 verses after the verse we quoted earlier. So the verse we quoted earlier describing their the praises. The Gemara, 2 verses later, the Gemara says, the verse says as follows: "Vayihi bahem ibnei Yehuda," and they were from the children of the tribe of Yehuda, and their names were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those are the names, the 4 of them. Amr Belezer says, "Kulam ibnei Yehudaim." All 4 of them were from the tribe of Yehuda. Now that would make sense in the context of the previous Gemara, because the previous Gemara talking about 6 descendants of Rus, all of whom had 6 praises. And on that list of 6, 4 of them was Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now if you're from Rus, then you're coming from King David. And if you're coming from King David, you're from the tribe of Yehuda. But Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani says, no. Daniel ibn Yehuda. Daniel himself was from the tribe of Yehuda. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, these 3, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Mishar Shvatim, did not come from the tribe of Yehuda, but they came from the other tribes, which would mean he disagrees or doesn't reckon with the understanding mentioned before, where the verse says that when Boaz gave Ruth 6 kernels, he was alluding to 6 grandchildren. He doesn't say that applies, or maybe it applies, but not to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, because he's of the opinion that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah did not come from Yehuda, but rather from other Shvatim.
That's before the exile of the 10 tribes?
No, this is well after.
After?
The exile of 10 tribes is the end of the first temple.
So
This is the end of the second temple.
No, that's the end of the first temple.
No, sorry, this is the end of the first temple, yeah, but it's still after anyway. It's still it's Sanhedrin, it's before, it's still before. It's still before, yeah. I'm thinking this at the end of the second temple. No, you're correct. It is, but it's still after. Nonetheless, the southern kingdom was primarily Yehuda, which is why the name Jews stuck. Yehudi, but with Binyamin, and there were other individual members of the other tribes who wanted to serve God and not the Baal, who snuck south.
And also Yirmiyahu took some back as well.
From the 10 tribes.
Yeah.
So it could have been any.
So there's always some remnant of the tribes.
Okay. So now, the Gemara says like this. The Gemara now backs up to the prophet of Yeshaya, which is a little bit before. And Yeshaya tells the king Chizkiyahu. Now, Chizkiyahu is the king of the southern kingdom, Yehuda, and he himself is a descendant of King David. So Yeshaya tells him like this. And from your children, he's prophesying about the exile to Babylon, to Bavel. That's what Yeshaya is telling Chizkiyahu, which is why Chizkiyahu prepares the people. He buries the ark, he buries the Aron, and he does other such things to prepare the people for the coming exile. So, Yeshaya, the prophet, tells Chizkiyahu, "Bibanecha sheyetzeh mimech," from the children that will come from you, Asher Telud, which you will give birth to, Yichu, they will be taken by the king of Bavel, Nebuchadnezzar, V'hayu sardisim beheichal melech, and there will be, quote, sardisim in the chamber of the king. So what does the word sardisim mean? So, to my understanding, the simple reading of the verse, before we even get to the Gemara, is the word sardisim means ministers. We'll get to that in a second. Sardisim means ministers. Now, how do you get from ministers from the word sardisim? This is my simple, I could be wrong about this, but this is my plain meaning. There's oftentimes in the verse where the word sin and the word samach, the letter sin and the letter samach are interchanged. It's often the case. Sin, sardim with a sin means ministers. A sar is a minister. But with a samach means something else.
Sarim with the samach is that they're removed.
So that's correct. That's correct. So the Gemara is now going to analyze why the verse calls them ministers with a samach rather than with a sin, the way it's properly written. So that's why I think the simple meaning means Yeshaya is telling them that your children will be ministers in the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. But the verse chooses to write the word ministers with a samach rather than the ordinary sin. They both make the same.
This may not be a bracha, it may be kind of like a curse, like you're going to be, the children will be taken away. It'll be like the.
Well, even according to this version, one is a curse and one is a sin. Let's see.
Yeah.
One is a praise and one is a curse. Let's see. In other words, the fact that they're being taken by the king is itself not a good thing. They're being held hostage by the king. That's true. But in terms of the word sardis, why we're using the letter samach, the Gemara is going to analyze that right now. So the Gemara asks, "My sardisim, why are they being referred to as sardisim with a samach?" Again, I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure that that's the simple meaning. Sar means minister. But anyway.
Yeah, leader.
Yeah, but even though it's with a samach here, but I think the simple meaning is like the kri versus the ksiv, the way it's written versus the way it's pronounced. The way it's pronounced is sar, and it makes no difference if it's a samach or a sin, right? It's not the only time where the verse does that. But the verse will use a samach instead of a sin, or a sin instead of a samach, and there's a dual meaning.
It should have been sarim, but there's sarisim, so the extra samach.
The extra samach at the second time. That also,
yeah,
that's true. That's true. Plural would have been sardim, not sardisim.
Okay, it would be
That's true.
Yeah.
At any rate, what's the implication of the sardisim business? And that there's a change in the language here. Samach and extra samach. So Rav Amarava says, sardisim mamish. They were literally sardisim. Sardisim means those who have been castrated.
Eunuchs.
What are they called?
Eunuchs.
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 And as Rashi points out, and this was the practice throughout a lot of history, that kings would castrate their ministers.
All of them, or only the one that guarded the women?
That was later in medieval countries, like especially in France, where the ones who would guard the queen would be castrated. But earlier, it was even, in other words, if they relied on a minister, they didn't want this guy to be distracted by the women in court, so they have him castrated, so they can focus on his work.
They all have pitched voices.
I don't know about that.
Also, another advantage.
I don't know about that.
Another advantage of castration: there's no fear of him taking over the kingdom because they have no.
Because he doesn't know. Yeah.
That was one of the.
Yeah. So they.
But they're free to serve
The simple. That's what Rashi said. He would castrate his.
So he doesn't get married. He doesn't have.
Well, he can get married, but he has no offspring.
no
They're always
children.
Rashi-
always worried about a rebellion from someone else.
I guess you should point out that Rashi, who lives, I don't know, 1,000 years after the story, writes, "Shekain darakon shel malachim." This is the way of kings, to castrate their ministers. Doesn't say this was the way of kings in past tense. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case back then in France too. Not just for those who served the women, but someone who the king relied on. He wanted him to be focused on his work, while the king can go hang out with the women in court. So he would castrate his ministers so they can work.
So Islam was doing that.
Sorry?
It's just been a common thing.
It must have been a common thing.
Even in the Haftorah on fast days, eunuchs are specifically mentioned as, I think we're supposed to welcome them back along with the converts, and some they mention eunuchs. It's like
Maybe people who were,
specifically mention them in the Haftorah.
I suppose these are the people who work for the king.
People would think would be excluded from the community now because of
Because they have no families.
the family. Exactly.
That was common with Islam. The Islamic leaders, emperors did that.
So that's what I'm saying. I think it seems common across the board with kings, at least from the Rashi's writing it. Okay, so that's one version, that they were literally eunuchs. That's the word?
No matter how you slice it.
Eunuchs.
Yep.
Eunuchs, yeah, it's like-
Okay.
EUNUCH.
Chanina says, not literally eunuchs, but shenis tarsa, pronounce the word, al-verizara b'yamehem. Like you were saying, the word sar, with a samach, means removal. So not that they were castrated, but that they were successful in removing idol worship. Now, they didn't remove completely, fully idol worship, but, as Rashi tells us, they demonstrated the worthlessness of idol worship. In their whole story, when they were thrown into the fiery pit and for refusing to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's idols and then survived, that demonstrated, and Nebuchadnezzar himself acknowledged, we talked about this before, Nebuchadnezzar started to praise Hashem and his mouth was held back because otherwise he would have embarrassed King David. That's how much he wanted to praise Hashem. So they proved idol worship's uselessness. And that's what it means to start that. They removed the validity of idol worship. So it's actually a praise in this prophecy, even though the prophecy overarchingly is the troubles of the Jewish people, that they're going to end up in Babylonia, subjugated to Nebuchadnezzar. But nonetheless, Yeshayahu sneaks in a praise by saying that these grandchildren of yours, Chizkiyahu, are later going to demonstrate the worthlessness of idol worship.
Still Quranic, so.
As I said, the overarching story is
because they're exiled, but still,
the overarching story of the prophecy is trouble, but Yeshayahu sneaks in a praise. Okay, now the Gemara is going to analyze these two versions. So this all makes sense. This is well if the following verse makes sense or can be taken literally if we follow the version that they had all their anatomy, but they just removed the Avodah Zarah. They removed idol worship. This would explain the verse which says, this is the verse where we're describing them surviving in the fiery pit for having refused to bow down to the idols. So in there, the verse says, and I see people, where's the actual verse on the side here? I see people, they're walking around, the fire is not touching their flesh, and nor the hair on their head. Okay, that's the next verse, sorry. The previous verse, I see 4 people, right, there was the 3 of them and the angel, going around, the fire is not touching them, and there is no blemish on them. So in praising them, when they're walking around the fire, the verse says there is no blemish on them. So if they had all their anatomy, and they just removed idol worship, so that's why there's no blemish on them. But according to the version we said they were actually castrated, why would you say that I see 4 people walking around without blemish? They clearly have a blemish. they're missing very vital parts of their body.
What's the cheveloiti?
I don't see
Chevel means a damage.
chevel as in a blemish. Chevel as a bruise.
Means yesh.
Chevel is
A bruise.
Bruise, like Kabbalah.
Chavala, like to bruise, but it's Aramaic.
Yeah.
Like us, they don't have any bruise. They don't have any blemish. So they may have no blemish. They're missing. So according to the version which says that they removed their idol worship, okay, so they have a blemish. They're a full whole body. But according to the one that says they're castrated, even though they're walking around the fire not touching them, but still they have blemish clearly.
Yeah, Nisi is like yesh in Hebrew.
Yeah.
See,
In Aramaic is yesh, yes.
An elf drops out, just you get
Okay.
yesh.
So says the Gemara. Therefore, you must say, "My v'chevel yasibuhun." What does it mean that I don't see any blemish in them? Or they have no blemish in them. Says the Gemara, "Chavol denora." It means in the context of what he's watching. He's watching the fire, and he says, "I don't see blemish." It doesn't mean I don't see blemish. Period. It means I don't see blemish in this context of a fire. The fire is not giving them a blemish. Simple enough.
First, also, this would argue when it was said that they had children later.
The Gemara is going to. We'll talk about that in a second. Yeah. So says the Gemara, but the verse says the next 2 verses later. So the Gemara, the verse spends 2 or 3 verses describing them walking around in the fire. The first verse mentioned that they had no blemish. And if 2 verses later, it's 2 verses later, the verse says V'reach nur aloi adas bohun. The smell or the smell of the fire, or like the spirit of the fire, the reach of the fire, didn't have any control over them. So the Gemara is basically asking, why would the verse earlier said they have no blemish? According to the one who says that they were not castrated, so it makes sense, I see no blemish, there is no blemish, period. According to the one who says they are castrated, you're telling me that when it says no blemish, you mean to tell me that the fire didn't give any blemish to them. But 2 verses later it already said that the smell of the fire didn't touch them. So the verse would not need to tell me twice that the fire didn't touch them. And thus the previous one, which says they had no blemish, ought to be taken literally. Which raises the question on the one who says that they are eunuchs, because they do have a blemish. They're missing body parts. Says the Gemara, no, both of them are talking about the fire. Both the verse which says they have no blemish and the verse which says there's no smell also talks about the fire, and it's two distinct miracles. Lo chavala, no blemish from the fire, no bruise, v'lo and no smell from the fire. A person can have, or smoke, from the smoke, I'm sorry. One can have one without the other. A person could in theory be burnt, but have no smell from the, not absorb the smell. Or in the reverse, a person could absorb the smell of a fire and not get burnt. And here the verse is telling us that there are two separate miracles. Number one, the flames didn't touch them, and number two, the smoke didn't damage or no smell.
A good example that when you burn the chametz on Pesach, you're nearby the fire. The smoke doesn't attach to the clothes. So
say it again.
Like the burn chametz for and in Perek Pesach.
Yeah, you smell.
You smell the smoke. Even after you leave, a few minutes, you still have the smoke. Nothing wrong.
If someone only does a fire once a year there, then yes. But I mean, like for anybody who does a fire, you get smelled. You smell.
Does the smoke that be considered a blemish if you were?
No, so the first one doesn't say. The first one says blemish. They're talking about the actual flames. The next one says that the reach, the smell, didn't have any control over them.
Didn't get into their clothes.
So in other words, they didn't absorb this.
That's one of the six, though.
No, the six praises were way earlier. Let's say we've gone on that already.
Okay.
The six praises were way earlier about their own person.
Okay.
They were smart, wise, smart, wise, self-control, all that.
I want to show here that the fire not only didn't burn them, even the smoke didn't get them. Really
Right, so it's two different miracles.
I know you working at a campfire, you get smell of smoke in your clothes.
That's
It's,
right.
Right.
It's two separate
even that
miracles.
they didn't get
A
that.
person
And
can.
you were the fire. That's
Right.
amazing.
I'm saying there's two different miracles. A person can get burnt and have no smell, or a person can have no smell and not get burnt, and get burnt. They're two separate miracles in the Gemara, and the verse is telling us both of them. Okay, so we'll stop over here, but I want to. Sorry?
We can still say they're eunuchs. That's the point.
Yeah.
It's the fire. That's right.
So the point. That's correct. The point being that the fact that the verse earlier says they had no blemish is not implication that their bodies are intact. The point is that the fire didn't touch them. And as for the redundancy in the verse, another verse says that the smell didn't get to them. The Gemara is pointing out that it's two separate miracles. This is all to substantiate the verse.
They smoke.
The smoke. One's the flames, one's the smoke.
Yeah.
So it's two separate miracles, and thus substantiating or validating validating the verse, the opinion which said that they were literally castrated, and still the verse could be correct when it says there's no blemish. That's the point. Okay, so stop over here. There's more coming on this God willing tomorrow. So I did want to point out, like Rabbi Gimple mentioned, Rashi tells us that if they are castrated, according to that version, then you have to go with the Gemara earlier discussed in the previous page. What happened to Hanan and Mishael and Isaiah after they emerged from the fire? Where did they go? There were different versions. Did they die from the spit of the nations? Did they die from the jealousy of the nations, from Ayin Hara? Or did they survive, go to Israel, and have children? According to the ones that said they were castrated, obviously they didn't have children. So you have to follow a different view. That's one thing to point out. Another thing I want to point out, and this is just, it occurred to me as we were talking about, so getting back to the six praises, and the Gemara we said is literally talking about their physical bloodletting, their physical, they never need to bloodlet because they were so healthy, physical good looks, and physical self-control, no laughing, no chatting, and no going to the bathroom in front of the king. And obviously, as you mentioned before, this can be read deeper as in their relationship to the King of Kings, to God, not just Nebuchadnezzar. And we mentioned that the Gemara says that their self-control was unsin, es atzman. They would force themselves, meaning to say, even if they have the urges, they would force themselves. Right? Following with me? So, it occurred to me the following. I'm just putting this out there, and perhaps it'll help us understand this a bit more. The praises, so it first talks about their physical body, good looks, and they were so healthy, and then it talks about their minds, good minds, chachma, bina, and das. That's three things, actually in the order of chachma, das, bina. They had good minds, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, or wisdom, knowledge, understanding. That's the order. And then it talks about their self-control. It skips anything about their character in terms of their emotions. It doesn't mention anything about how they felt, whether they were loving people, kind people. It doesn't mention that. The verse doesn't mention that in praise. So perhaps in chapter, I think it's 16, maybe 15. No, it's 16. In chapter 16, the Alter Rebbe talks about someone who is contemplating God's greatness with the objective of trying to engender a love of Hashem, but it's not working. He understands everything. He's understanding all of it. He's doing the entire Westbury. He's contemplating all the rest of it, but he's not getting the feelings. But says out there like this: he comes to the conclusion in his mind, I ought to love God. Given everything I just understood about Hashem, I ought to love Him. Following? Mm-hmm. But it's not. I'm just not actually feeling the love, but I ought to feel the love. Says the Alter Rebbe like this: if someone uses that conclusion, I ought to love God, and he uses that conclusion to motivate him to behave for Hashem, it skips over his emotions. It goes from his mind, I ought to love God, to behavior that I actually behave according to what I ought to love. So if I ought to love Him, then I'm going to put on tefillin for Him. If I ought to love Him, then I don't do that for Him. Following?
Mm-hmm. The actions, yeah. But
so the actions, so says the Alter Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe applies the...
It's as if you did.
That's correct.
Without apparent emotion.
Without the actual full emotion. So the Alter Rebbe applies that which the Gemara says, Machshava tova, HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzaref l'ma'atzah. A good thought, God connects it to action. So the Alter Rebbe points out, he doesn't say this explicitly, but this is the implication, that usually when the Gemara wants to tell you that when you did something, God considers it as something else, it says, My law love HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or My law love HaKosov, which means the Gemara should have said, a good intention, God considers as if you get it done. That's the way the simple reading of the Gemara is. I wanted to do a kind act, I didn't get to do it, and God makes as if I acted. But that's not the language. The Gemara says, a good thought, God connects to an act, as if to say there is an act, there is a good thought, but God's making a connection between the two. So here's how the Alter Rebbe applies it. A person has a good thought, he comes to the conclusion, I ought to love Hashem, he has the action, he's behaving accordingly, and God makes the connection between the two, even though it's lacking the emotion. And this, the Alter Rebbe says, is part of the struggle of Beinoni sometimes, who's not a tzaddik and can just get emotions and love for Hashem. So if this verse is describing a Beinoni, whereas Einstein is Ansman, he's forcing himself, controlling himself, right? Even though he may want to laugh, but Einstein is Ansman, he's forcing himself not to laugh. It would then follow that he's this Beinoni of chapter 16, where he's going from intellect, wisdom, and understanding straight from there to action. Or skipping over the emotional part, because if he had the emotional part, he wouldn't necessarily need to force himself. Right? If a person has the emotions for Hashem, he's not forcing himself to behave for God. He's acting out of love. But over here the Gemara is saying he's forcing himself. So he may be even lacking the love. But he has the wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And the wisdom, understanding, and knowledge tells him that he ought to love Hashem. So even if he doesn't love Hashem, he's going to force himself to behave accordingly.
So it's not propelling his action.
It's not. It's the I ought to love. It's correct. It's the intelligence. That's correct. So he's going from Chachma bin Adas. That's where the praises are going, from Chachma bin Adas straight to action. Perhaps we still need to understand what the first praises, which precipitate the intellect, which is they're good looking and they're healthy. That precipitates the wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, and precipitates self-control. So we still need to understand what that is. But I'm just throwing this out there as another item that you can think about when we try to make sense of this on a spiritual level. Okay, God willing, tomorrow more details on the life of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Have a wonderful day, everybody.